challenges on this, and some degree of acrimony over whether or not Barrett, in fact, does replace Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. And you end up with a situation where, with all of the domestic discord and violence that we have seen in American cities since the George Floyd tragedy, I think that that would be just a drop in the bucket compared to the kind of violence and political instability that we would see when massive numbers of Americans would become weaponized on all sides of an issue like this, with the idea in mind that they were being defrauded by someone of what they believe was the legitimate outcome of the election. This RT op-ed went on to say that even regardless of that very draconian scenario, which is a very live possibility, I think that's a reason for your question. It is a live and real and dangerous possibility. But even if it doesn't go to that point, I think that there is a process in the delegitimization of American institutions where people across the political spectrum don't trust their government for some very good reasons. They don't trust corporate media for some very good reasons. They don't trust establishment religious figures, quote unquote, for some very good reasons. The crisis in belief, the crisis in trust in Americans in their fundamental institutions and in each other, it seems to me, has reached a point where even if the election itself is not contested, leading up to an inauguration day that has to be postponed, I will still forecast what this RT op-ed piece was talking about, and that is a level of delegitimization in the political process and in our institutions in this country that will ultimately prove to be the demise of the American Republic, and that's not all of the American Empire, I'm sorry. Maybe we can get a republic back here. But in the context of the kind of political and social instability that I think you guys quite rightly see is going on here, who can believe with what's happening internally in this country that we ought to be taking on Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela in some kind of a military conflict? I mean, this is about as crazy as Belshazzar, as reported in the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel, failing to see the handwriting on the wall, or even after the prophet tells him that his reign's over, Belshazzar says, well, okay, my reign's over, let's still have a party. And whether you believe in the narrative of that book or not, according to Daniel 6, the end of his reign came that night when the Medes destroyed him. That's about the point that we have reached in the United States, where we've still got so many people in this country congratulating themselves because we're the greatest country on the face of the earth, at the same time that the three of us, at least, who are talking with each other tonight, are seeing a far different America, and are seeing an America, I think, on the precipice of a disaster that not only will portend the end of the empire, and some of that, by the way, is good, but in the wake of the power vacuum that will follow, what would follow such a demise of American political fortunes? We really don't know. But I think John Kerry was suggesting the same thing that John F. Kennedy said during the Cuban Missile Crisis in his office when he was talking to his brother and to Kenny McDonald, and the president was talking about a book that he had read earlier that summer in 1962 called The Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman's book, about how all of these miscalculations and idiotic decisions in myopia led to a First World War. Kennedy, of course, skillfully and by the grace of God, helped to maneuver us out of such a catastrophe. Both he and Khrushchev came to an understanding that this simply could not be allowed to be. There were a lot of people in the American military establishment at the time who were actually disenchanted with Kennedy. I know that from the inside because my father was involved in it at the time, and my father was not one of them who was disenchanted with Kennedy, by the way. But nonetheless, in the environment now, can you imagine if the United States faced a crisis of the magnitude that we did in October of 1962 with either Trump or Joe Biden in the White House?
You don't have the wisdom there. You don't have the wisdom there. There's a
Yeah, none.
feedback on your end. There's a feedback on your end at this moment.
Oh,
Could
okay.
you go out of and come right back in the chat?
Me?
There's,
Me or
oh, now
Rashid?
you're clear. You're clear now.
Am I
No,
clear
you're
now?
clear
Oh,
now.
okay.
You're clear.
Okay.
Yeah,
They don't have the
but I want.
wisdom.
Oh, you know what? I think hey, we may have offended some people on the air, because they're bothering the sound system and they're
Well, I
disconnecting
told
us
you
and
the
everything.
NSA has got their internet operation, global internet surveillance operation with Microsoft right here in San Antonio. So maybe our ratings just went down suddenly.
And they continue to throw me off also. But so I guess this what we're talking about is really major because no one is really speaking on these issues. But I wanted to ask you a question about Obama. Why
Yes.
does Obama in the black community, you think, get a pass for some of the most detrimental policies that he's enacted against Black America? And most black people don't realize that he bombed more African countries and more Muslim countries than most presidents that preceded him.
Exactly, and Sarah Abdallah has talked about this many times on Twitter. She's kept the statistics on these bombings and the number of people that President Obama has killed in these insane drone strikes, which are just apparently a different version of the idiocy that Trump has been conducting since he's come into the White House. Maybe not as much of it, but the Soleimani assassination now has Obama and Trump running neck and neck in terms of some of this irresponsibility. But the phenomenon that you're talking about here, Rashid, well, I obviously can't be a spokesman for the African American community. It seems to me that phenomenon with Obama among many African Americans is very similar to what I see among a lot of white Republican voters who wave these flags and who say that Trump is making America great again, when whether you're looking at the national debt of this country or the ongoing character of these discretionary wars or the Soleimani assassination or these idiotic things that Pompeo is apparently and Netanyahu are prodding Trump to become more directly involved in when it comes to Iran, can any of us fail to see that to that extent, the average white suburban GOP voter shares many of the same true believer characteristics as a lot of well-meaning African Americans who would vote for a Democrat, and certainly an African American Democrat like Barack Obama, not recognizing that in many cases, whether you're talking about Obama in the Democratic Party or you're talking about someone like George W. Bush or Donald Trump, that ultimately the nefarious forces that I believe have the ultimate control of American policies as it relates to fiat money and the Fed, as it relates to American national security policy in the multinational corporations and the Israeli lobby and so forth. To that extent, these true believers on both sides of the political aisle don't see that they're completely missing the bullseye when they seem to be somewhat on top of things when the other party's bum is in there. And they seem to be oblivious to what's going on when their own party's bum is in there. So in this case, with George W. Bush and Donald Trump, I, as a Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul Republican, say, well, there's no getting around this. If you've got any degree of intellectual honesty or moral integrity at all, George W. Bush and Donald Trump are two of the biggest boobs who have ever held the presidency in the history of the United States. Now, they have some company competing with them, but the notion that one appears at a Make America Great rally and worships Trump as some sort of a messianic figure, frankly, for anyone with any degree of intelligence or intellect or honesty or historical perspective, if I might say this bluntly, that sort of thing is enough to make me throw up. It's utterly sickening.
Now, when I wanted to bring something up. I was watching an interview. It was about 2 years ago, I believe it was, and it was being translated in English, but it was President Putin talking, and he was being asked a question about better relations with the United States. And he
Yes.
said that it does not matter who is the president of the United States once they're elected or put into office. Men in black suits come and tell them what to do and what not to do. That's what he said.
I believe
Could you
I saw
elaborate
that
on that?
same interview with the subtitles, of course. I don't speak Russian.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
as proof of that very thing, I would point everyone to November the 22nd, 1963, with the assassination of John Kennedy in Dealey Plaza in Dallas on Elm Street. Who were the forces ultimately involved in that assassination? That's a subject where I've read thousands and thousands of
Me.
pages. That's a subject where I've engaged all kinds of people in conversation on that subject who have written some of these books and so forth. I've even interviewed in the past the guy who took the JFK autopsy photographs at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. That goes all the way back to a media thing that we did in 2001 before 9/11. But the fact is, that is the fundamental question. And I think since John Fitzgerald Kennedy and his assassination, and the assassination, tragically, later of his brother Robert Kennedy in June of 1968, that the question about who ultimately killed those two, and for that matter, you could throw Martin Luther King into the mix too. In this case, we're talking about the president of the United States and an attorney general of the United States, whom I believe would have been elected had he not been murdered in 1968. That this gets perilously close to why I believe, although I'm speaking for him and I really shouldn't be doing that, I would suspect that President Putin, if he was listening to this conversation tonight, would understand that, yeah, the Kennedy assassination shows exactly who's running the United States in truth. And that when you look at all of these American presidents who have followed Kennedy, these are all people to a greater or lesser degree have operated within certain parameters and have understood that if they went outside those parameters, especially when it comes to things like the Israeli lobby and the Fed, that they wouldn't live too long. And I think that is the undoubtedly, in my own mind, the essence of what is in President Putin's mind. And I think he's a very smart and cunning man. He's a very shrewd man. And I think when you look at what he's doing, or some of the things that I've seen out of Medvedev in recent times, or I follow this General Sergei Shoigu rather closely,
Yeah.
both in
I do.
Russian media as well as on Twitter, they're planning accordingly because they have it figured that regardless of who prevails in this mockery of an election in the first Tuesday of November, regardless of who gets inaugurated, assuming that we have a clear-cut, agreed-upon winner in January, that the issues involving the forces that want to destroy Russia as a part of the creation of a new world order and a world government, I think that's what ultimately is involved here, and that the forces behind this want to bring all of the nations of the world under this aegis with the banking system that is based upon the American dollar as the reserve currency of the world. This has a lot to do with the death of Gaddafi. This has a lot to do with the death of Saddam Hussein. This has a lot to do with the attempts at murdering President Assad by the use of these Sunni Wahhabic organizations and so forth and so on. And when we understand it from that perspective, those of us who grew up as kids in an environment where we trusted America, where we waved American flags, and where we assumed that if we were in a conflict with a foreign power, it was because America was right and the other side was wrong. That model died for me a long time ago after I grew up and began to look at a lot of historical evidence that I was never taught in school, that I had to learn on my own through research and through talking to very educated, astute people in these areas who had not been brainwashed by the American media and the American educational system. During the entire time that I lived in Iran, when I found out that the CIA had something to do with the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, and I would ask a few American policymakers that went to the same church that I did, they would respond with, well, Mossadegh was a communist. Oh, okay. He was a Soviet-backed KGB stooge. Oh, okay. Well, all these years later, some intelligent reading and reflection proves that that is complete poppycock. I have right in this studio library behind me that you can't see, where I have hundreds of books in here, theological and historical and political. I have the American Free Press's republication of all of the CIA documents about Operation Ajax that were obtained from the George Washington University National Security Archive file through Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. When you read what the CIA and the British MI6 themselves were saying about Operation Ajax at the time, then we begin to see what a ruthless and unscrupulous operation this was, that the United States was involved in destroying the political autonomy of that country for the same reasons that we're now trying to do this with Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and so forth and so on, and that ultimately it caught up with the United States in 1978-79 with the overthrow of Pahlavi, and I'm sure, sadly, it's going to catch up with us again with a government that is now assassinating Soleimani, or that is involved in using ISIS against Gaddafi in Libya, supporting openly Clinton and others this extrajudicial assassination of Gaddafi, and openly laughing about this as though this is something to be proud of, or utilizing ISIS to try and destroy the Assad regime in Syria. Or all the nefarious things that we do with Israel in the Middle East. All of a sudden, this mythology has come crashing down, and reasonable people like myself who have lived in this part of the world over time, or who have studied and read a lot of things from a lot of sources that are not kids in American educational circles are not being exposed to or told exist by the American media. It's then and only then that a person of goodwill across the political spectrum steps back from this and says, my land, I supported this at the time, or thought it was a moral policy at the time. What in the world was I thinking? If you were to have talked to me some 35 years ago, or go back 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan was first elected as the president of the United States, I believed all kinds of things that are frankly laughable now. When I look back and think, I was a person of goodwill. I thought that Ronald Reagan was the Messiah on the white horse and so forth. Only over the course of the last 40 years, through my own experiences, my own research, my own travel, not simply to Iran and other places in the Middle East, but going to South Africa, going to Malaysia, attending these Kuala Lumpur war crimes tribunals a few years ago, 2013, I think, where I actually heard firsthand from witnesses what it was that the Israelis did in these Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in southern Lebanon with the complete connivance and support of the United States. This was to actually listen to the testimony, to see the evidence and so forth of what it was and what it is that my government is supporting, not only Sabra and Shatila going back to 1982, but all other manner of atrocity over decades since and decades prior. It's a rather sobering reassessment on my part of all sorts of things that I at one time believed had validity that now have me shaking my own head, not at my malice as a younger person, but at my complete historical and political ignorance, which is why I have some degree of compassion for people who are well-meaning on the American right who continue to believe garbage like this, because they've not had much in the way of exposure to anyone within their own movement who's come out of that sort of thinking, who can say, hey, look, do you really know who killed Kennedy? Do you really know about Israel's attack on the USS Liberty? Do you really know about the Lavon affair? Do you really know about the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem? Do you know that Jack Ruby, the assassin of Lee Harvey Oswald, was Jacob Rubenstein, a Zionist gun runner working for the Habilion Association, not the Habilion Association? Well, Jack Ruby, Jacob Rubenstein. And Jacob Rubenstein was, in fact, a Zionist gun runner in the late 1940s, working with the Meyer Lansky Israeli crime syndicate to run materials to the Zionist terrorists.
Excuse me, I have to cut you off. I have to cut you off for a second. Let me tell you, every time you repeat that part, your microphone messes up. So you know what that
Ah,
is. That's why I keep saying repeat that
well,
every
let's try
time
it
you are
again.
saying. Just try it again every
Yeah.
time.
Who? How
So
we
the
doing
Jack
now?
Ruby, we're doing good. We're
Jack
doing
Ruby,
good.
Jakob Rubenstein. Jakob Rubenstein, we are told, was working for Sam Giancana and the Chicago Crime Syndicate.
Ooh.
Yes, they knew each other, but Jakob Rubenstein, aka Jack Ruby, was also a gun runner for the anti-Castro Cuban exile forces that were going to be used in the Bay of Pigs operation. Jack Ruby, aka Jakob Rubenstein, was also involved as a Zionist gun runner for the Irgun and the Stern Gang in the run up to Israel's Declaration of Independence. And Jack Ruby was in fact a bagman, Jakob Rubenstein, for the Meyer Lansky Israeli Crime Syndicate, which was directly involved in the Kennedy assassination and which controlled the political future of one John McCain. That's how deeply these things go. And when we start asking ourselves, how does this fit in with more conventional, credible conspiracy theories about how and why President Kennedy was killed? We can simply ask the simple question. The anti-Castro Cubans and James Jesus Angleton always come up, and
They're doing you
rightfully
again.
so. But what's
They're
that?
doing you
They're
like
doing it
this
again?
again. Yeah.
Yes, well, not surprising. It's not surprising,
Now,
folks. And let's give it another try. These guys here in San Antonio with the NSA are doing everything possible to do what they do to me at least 5 times a year. Jakob Rubenstein, a.k.a. Jack Ruby, linked to the Meyer Lansky Israeli Crime Syndicate. Aha, here we go, folks. Meyer Lansky was the OSS, that was the World War II front runner or forerunner to the CIA. Meyer Lansky was the OSS's liaison to the Batista regime in Cuba before the Castro's revolution in Cuba. That's the connection of Lansky and Ben Gurion and James Jesus Angleton and Frank Sturgis, who was working for the Mossad, by the way, and Jakob Rubenstein, also known as Jack Ruby, in terms of the bigger picture of who killed Kennedy that gets back to Michael Collins Piper's book, Final Judgment, or check the Unz review, which has the complete text of the Michael Collins Piper book, Final Judgment. There's also a very fine article there by Lawrence Guyano entitled, Did Israel Kill the Kennedys? Take a look at that, folks, and you'll begin to see how this cabal that controls both of the major parties in the United States has been pulling the wool over your eyes and mine for decades.
hey, so on that subject, before we go a little further, what about? I read something. I don't know how credible this is, but they were talking about George Herbert Walker Bush being in Dallas on the day of the assassination of Kennedy, also, and that he may have played a hand in it, also.
That I'm not sure of, but I will tell you this. Credible evidence does exist that in 1963 and 64, when Lyndon Johnson was putting together his Warren Commission, that when we look at who it was that was the liaison to both the CIA and the FBI in the investigation of any alleged Cuban angle to the Kennedy assassination, that person was, in fact, George Herbert Walker Bush.
I also heard that they met at Clint Murchison, the Dallas Cowboys owner's place.
I'll tell you this. I'll tell you what I know about that. I was 8 years old at the time, so I wasn't invited to the party. And my dad was at the Air War College in Montgomery, Alabama that year. But let me simply say this: Madeline Brown, the late mistress to Lyndon Baines Johnson, Madeline Brown kept a diary. And a number of years ago, when I was covering the Kennedy assassination for the Republic Broadcasting Network, Madeline Duncan Brown, I believe is her full name, her lawyer contacted me and offered to show me Madeline Duncan Brown's diary in her own handwriting, okay? And looking at her own handwriting, she, in fact, makes reference to the night of November 21st, 1963, to that gathering at Clint Murchison's home, which not only involved Lyndon Johnson, but according to Madeline Duncan Brown, also involved Richard Nixon, who supposedly had left Dallas earlier that day. Nixon's conventional story is that he was in Dallas because he at the time was on the board of directors of the Coca-Cola Company. And Madeline Duncan Brown names some of the other significant figures that were at Murchison's house the night before the assassination, with, of course, Lyndon Johnson being the most sinister of all of them. And according to Madeline Duncan Brown's diary, she, the then mistress of LBJ, she commented that as she and LBJ were leaving the party that night, and the subject of the way in which LBJ had resented the attitude of both of the Kennedy brothers toward him, Madeline Duncan Brown made the claim in her diary and subsequently on YouTube before her death that Lyndon Johnson stated to her definitively that after tomorrow, meaning November 22nd, 1963, after tomorrow, I won't have to worry about the Kennedys anymore, quote unquote. So check out Madeline Duncan Brown and her diaries and any YouTube materials where she might still be on there. She's no longer living, of course, but I find her report to be very, very credible, and certainly all of these various players that knew that Mr. Kennedy was about to be killed, nonetheless, in their own way, shrink in comparison to the Meyer Lanskys and the David Ben-Gurions and the James Jesus Angletons and the Frank Sturgises and the E. Howard Hunts, who quite clearly were involved in the assassination. And in the case of E. Howard Hunt, that's even been corroborated by his son posthumously, who wrote a book about his conversations with his dad on the subject before the elder Hunt's passing from this world.
Wow. That's a lot there. So it shows us the system is corrupt to the core. Then it's corrupt, and
it is so corrupt that it's mind-boggling.
Whoa.
As a matter of fact, you guys know of Dan Rather, right?
Yes.
Dan Rather, in November of 1963, the now retired Dan Rather of CBS News, who still pontificates on Twitter with some of his ideas. You can go back on YouTube and witness what I did as an 8-year-old boy at the time. Dan Rather was on November the 22nd, 1963, as a CBS newsman working for Walter Cronkite News. Dan Rather was viewing the Zapruder film, which people like I were not allowed to see at the time. It was not released to anyone in the general public for 12 years. Mr. Rather was saying that when Mr. Kennedy was struck in the head by the fatal bullet, that the president's head moved violently forward. It's right there on YouTube. You can see in retrospect at the time that that's exactly what Dan Rather said. And I remember 12 years later, when I was sitting in the Valparaiso Student Union with the late African-American comedian Dick Gregory, who had come to Valparaiso University to show us the Zapruder film and to talk about the Kennedy assassination. When you saw the film in its entirety and saw the infamous frame 313, where even as the late Ed McMahon would have put it in the Karnak routine with Johnny Carson, a child of 10 or a child of 8 or a child of 5 could plainly see that the president's head was driven violently backward at the time of the head explosion from the fatal shot, which meant only one thing according to the laws of physics, and that is that however many times Mr. Kennedy was shot from behind, that the fatal headshot for sure had to have been fired from his right front. And of course, the Parkland Hospital surgeons, we later learned, years later, said that both the head wound and the neck wound that the Warren Commission said were wounds of exit were in fact wounds of entry. What was it that Rather was concealing 57 years ago. What has the mainstream media in the United States been attempting to conceal ever since? This gets at the heart of things that have happened in American history, the likes of which have been falsified to the American public time and again. Spain being accused of sinking the U.S. Maine and Havana Harbor. The real truth of the sinking of the Lusitania. The real truth of FDR in Pearl Harbor. The real truth of the Kennedy assassination. The real truth surrounding 9/11. The real truth about the Iran-Iraq war. The real truth about why we invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq. All of these real truths that prove to be obscured by an American media and American government who weave constant untruth to people. This leads us into this election where, if we understand the bigger picture, we need to understand that that which is rarely that which appears to be when it comes to mainstream media in the United States and to their very, very convenient tools. Look at Operation Mockingbird and the CIA operation that involved the complete compromise of mainstream media at the time of Operation Mockingbird. And then, of course, there are the words of the late CIA Director William Colby, who died a very, very troublesome and mysterious death, by the way, in April 1996. The book Shadow Warrior will underscore that what happened to Mr. Colby was not what mainstream media said happened to him on the night of his drowning. But William Colby once said that in terms of mainstream media in the United States, that there wasn't a reporter of any consequence in mainstream media who wasn't under the control of the Central Intelligence Agency. And that, ironically enough, as I've already mentioned, was said by a gentleman who in April of 1996 mysteriously disappeared in the Patuxent River under circumstances that are far different from what was advertised then and what American mainstream media would continue to maintain were the circumstances of his death.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mark Dankof, for coming here. We have to have you back soon.
Hey, anytime. I like working with you guys. Much better than Wolf Blitzer or Tucker Carlson. Much better. We don't make any money, but we're much better.
Right. And so we got to get you back here. I wish we could get you back next week and go and just roll through what you were just saying and go into depth on this. We would love to have you back here.
Hey, anytime you guys want, we can get it arranged. I enjoy appearing on a show like this. And to the extent that there's anyone out there who is being at all helped by this, it's worthwhile. My former longtime radio partner, Mark Glenn, who is a Lebanese American, a Roman Catholic, very much involved in alt media for many years. He's now largely retired to his ranch with his wife and 10 kids in Idaho. But he and I used to talk about why we continued doing this to our own professional and financial and career marginalization and detriment. And he said, the reason that we're in this is because there's an element of the prophetic that's involved. And the other thing is that to the extent that there's anybody out there listening to us who understands that what we're saying is largely true, and they understand that there's at least somebody out there who knows what the truth is, then those folks out there, whether it's 1 or 10 or 200 or 500 in an individual show, or whether it's an audience of 5 million, which I've occasionally drawn on press television, there are average folks out there of all kinds of nationalities, including the American variety, who are good people who simply need to know that they're not alone. We're in this together.
We salute you and we thank you, and we'll talk behind the scenes. Thank you so much. You have a blessed night.
Hey, I sure will. God bless, guys. Take care.
God bless you. All right.